Hi there, I'm USBC Director of Coaching Stephen Padilla. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a part of the approach that's real specific and maybe something you're not looking at when it comes to the overall approach. Let's talk specifically about footwork, kind of where it goes, what it looks like, perhaps what we see most often in most players. We'll start with just the basic information for footwork, which is the number of steps that somebody takes. One of the coolest rules I think in bowling is that the only rule is really stay behind the foul line. We don't knock down as many pins as possible, but nobody counts how many steps we're supposed to have or what's exactly the most or the least. It's really kind of up to your own interpretation. So different size leg lengths are going to have different numbers of steps going throughout our approach. So whether you're taking 1 or 2 or 3 steps or whether you're taking 8 or 10 or 11 steps, it really doesn't matter as long as you stay behind the foul line. So most often what we see though is a 4 and or a 5-step approach, depending on where the player's playing. Perhaps some of the players that step in front of a ball return or around a part of the approach that needs to be navigated during an approach, they may have an abbreviated number of steps. But for the most part, it really doesn't matter, and the pinfall doesn't matter based on the number of steps you're taking. It really just is there as an overall identifier for you to know exactly what you're doing and how to repeat shots time and time again based on the number that you use. What we see a lot of times though is a 4-step approach for most beginning players is really where they get the sequence of the arm swing matching the footwork. So overall, the number of steps doesn't matter as long as you've got somewhere in there that swing tempo matching that lower body. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is the most often seen textbook version of what we see for step length versus perhaps an advanced version. Now the textbook typically for the longest time said the length of each step should get a little bit longer as you go through the approach. So most of the times what we would see was the player would start with a small step, their second step would be a little larger, third step almost the largest, and their last step, which was typically a slide, was their longest step of that textbook style. What we see most often nowadays is a different sequence, and that is going to be where the first step is going to have a medium length to it. Your second step, again, probably medium length, but your third step of a 4-step is going to be the shortest distance. That's the pivot or a power step length we talk about in most players' games. It's a transition from the ball changing direction from the top of the swing into the downswing. And then we'll see a long step or a long slide depending on how the player finishes at the foul line. As a whole, whether you're using the textbook style or whether you're using the advanced style, we tend to see overall acceleration from start to finish being our biggest key. Make sure from start to finish that you continue to accelerate throughout, and then acceleration should continue all the way up until the foul line right at release. That should be the only deceleration or the stop because we don't want to go over the foul line, obviously. Also relative to footwork, we want to talk a little bit about not how fast or slow it's moving, but how about direction, laterally, left and right on the approach. A lot of players will call this drift. So let's clear up drift for a second. Drift is really specific when you talk about the definition of the term, and drift means that you typically don't have any position where you're starting or finishing that is exactly the same. The example that we give sometimes is that you may start on the 20 board, for example, and you'll land when you're done at the approach somewhere on 22. Again, I'm kind of making it up at this point. So you go 20 to 22. Then you may go 20 to 23 and 20 to 21, perhaps 20 to 24, and that's kind of drifting across the approach. But if a player starts on the same board, 20, and finishes on the same board each time, I wouldn't necessarily call that a drift. So they're going to start on 20, maybe they go to 22, and 20 and 22, and shot after shot they go to the same location. There's a lateral movement in there. There's not necessarily a drift. Now, it's simply because it's not on the same board, players will often call that a drift, but it's really not a drift in that case. Identifying where you start and where you finish in your footwork can be a key component to recognizing whether or not you're going to be able to repeat the same shots in the same direction. So don't concern yourself with whether you start and finish on the same board, just see whether or not you're doing that consistently from shot to shot. If you're finishing on a different board but it's the same each shot, that's where you want to make sure you're consistent. That way your repeatability and your accuracy are the same. Drift can be a bad thing if it's inconsistent, but lateral movement can be a great thing if it's the same. So let's talk a little bit now from footwork onto the type of approaches you may run into. One of the things we see a lot of times is the approaches just get sticky. There's a lot of tools out there to help combat something like that. We certainly want to make sure that we're aware of those either as a player or a coach, and that way whenever we come into that situation we've got some option as to what we can do. So a sticky approach may be some humidity, it could be the birthday parties and the stuff that happened the night before where they didn't quite clean all the cake off the approaches. There's always something inside there that perhaps makes that environment for us. And one of the things we can do, and one of the easiest things we see most often, is players will actually take and they'll adjust the sole or heel combination on the bottom of a pair of shoes, and that'll help them combat that sticky or that tacky approach. Another thing players have do, they've actually cut off the toe of a sock perhaps and laid that on the top. It kind of does the same thing as interchanging your soles and heels if you have that option on your shoe, but it's also an option. One other thing is players try to find a little bit of dust in the bowling center somewhere. So they'll look underneath the ball returns perhaps, or some of the places that may not get dusted a lot, and they'll find a little bit of dust to put on the bottom of their soles if they don't have those interchangeables. And that'll give them a chance to also find their way through a sticky environment. So go the opposite direction now. If they're not too sticky, sometimes they're too slippery, or there's a lot less friction between your sole and the approach. Some ways to combat that. A lot of players that you'll see nowadays, instead of just being able to change a sole or heel combination, will have some kind of moisture they'll create. So they may, and it may not be the best way to do it, but they'll lick the hand, for example, put it on the bottom of the sole or the heel. A lot of times they may shorten the approach to give themselves a slower tempo. That way they're not sliding as far in a slippery environment. More than anything in that environment is you want to find balance. So you want to make sure your upper body stays over your lower body and you don't have your footwork out from underneath you. So use the interchangeables, find a little bit of moisture. We can't alter the surface. We don't want to recommend altering the surface of the approach because we have a playing environment where there's more people affected. So as a whole, be familiar with what you can do with your tool set to make sure that you've got plans for that sticky or that slippery approach. As a whole, the footwork is very important in today's game. It helps with balance, it helps with consistency, and without great footwork, we really run the risk of not being able to repeat shots, getting comfortable, and or being comfortable with adjustments if we can't get our feet underneath us. So make sure you're comfortable with what you look like, what you're capable of doing, and that you have your tools in place so that any approach you run into is going to be just fine for you to be able to adjust to.